Certain things people only do when no one is watching, not because they're ashamed, not because they're hiding something, but because some parts of intelligence only come alive in solitude. We usually think of intelligence as something public, something measurable, something that performs well in classrooms, meetings, debates, interviews, and social situations. But some of the rarest forms of intelligence are almost invisible. They don't always look charismatic, they don't always sound impressive, and they definitely don't always fit into the world's definition of smart. Because this kind of intelligence doesn't just solve problems. It observes itself, it questions its own motives, it notices contradictions. It can sit in silence long enough to hear what most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. And that's where the twist begins. Because what if your intelligence isn't rare because you know more, but because you can tolerate more truth? What if the real sign of unusual intelligence is not how well you function in the outer world, but what you do when you're alone with your inner one? Carl Jung believed that beneath the social self, the polished self, the acceptable self, the self that knows how to smile on cue and say the right thing, there is something far deeper. A hidden world, a shadow, a private theater where your fears, instincts, memories, fantasies, and unlived possibilities all wait for your attention. Most people spend their whole lives running from that inner world. But a rare kind of person enters it willingly. And if you've ever felt like your deepest habits only make sense in private, if you've ever done strange, intense, deeply reflective things when alone that you could never fully explain to other people, this video may explain why. Here are 7 things you only do alone if your intelligence is extremely rare. And the deeper truth is, these are not just habits. They are signs that your mind is not merely trying to survive reality, it is trying to understand it. 1. You have full conversations with people who aren't there, not just random imaginary arguments, not just replaying what you should have said. I'm talking about something much deeper. You sit alone, in your room, in your car, in the shower, late at night, and suddenly you're speaking to someone who isn't physically there. Maybe it's a parent. Maybe it's someone you loved. Maybe it's someone who betrayed you. Maybe it's an older version of yourself. Maybe it's a person you haven't even met yet. And to the outside world, this might look strange. But psychologically, it can reveal something extraordinary. Because rare intelligence often takes the form of inner dialogue. It means your mind doesn't just experience life, it processes life through multiple layers. You don't merely react to events, you create an internal council around them. One part of you is hurt, one part of you is rational, one part of you is suspicious, one part of you is wiser than your age, one part of you is still 5 years old and terrified. And when you're alone, all of them begin to speak. Most people are dominated by a single voice: impulse, fear, ego, habit. But highly unusual minds often experience themselves as a kind of inner plurality. Not madness, depth. A recognition that the self is not a single flat surface, but a whole landscape. This is why solitude can become so alive for you. Because when the world goes quiet, the psyche gets loud. And here's the Jungian twist. What you call talking to yourself may actually be your unconscious trying to become conscious. Those imaginary conversations aren't always pointless. Sometimes they are rehearsals for truth. Sometimes they are delayed grief. Sometimes they are a courtroom where your soul tries to finally say what your mouth never could. And maybe the reason you do this alone is because other people interrupt the process too early. They want the polished version, the summarized version, the socially acceptable version. But when you're alone, you let the thought unfold fully. You let the anger speak. You let the wound answer back. You let the wiser voice emerge after the emotional one burns itself out. That's not overthinking. That's deep psychic processing. In a shallow culture, people mistake inner complexity for dysfunction. But some of the rarest forms of intelligence look exactly like this. A person alone in a room, speaking to invisible figures, and becoming more honest with themselves than they ever are in public. 2. You disappear to think before you decide what you really feel. Some people know what they feel immediately. You don't, not because you're disconnected, but because your mind doesn't trust first impressions. When something happens, a betrayal, a compliment, an opportunity, an insult, a sudden attraction, a strange discomfort, you often need to be alone before you know what you actually think about it. In the moment, you may seem calm, or neutral, or hard to read. People may even assume you're emotionally detached, but that's rarely true. What's really happening is that your mind is gathering evidence from multiple levels at once. Your body noticed something, your instincts noticed something, your memory attached something to it, your shadow reacted to it, your social mask filtered it, and your conscious mind is still trying to catch up. So instead of responding immediately, you withdraw. Not always physically, sometimes just mentally. You go quiet, you delay the text, you walk alone, you stare at the ceiling, you let the event echo. And only in solitude does the real answer arrive. This is one of the clearest signs of rare intelligence. You don't confuse immediacy with truth. You understand that first reactions are often contaminated by ego, by fear, by the need to appear unbothered, by the desire to be liked, by old wounds disguised as present clarity. So you wait. And in waiting, you listen. That is rare, because most people are trained to react quickly and call it authenticity. But not everything fast is honest. Sometimes what feels instant is just conditioning. Sometimes your first feeling is not your deepest feeling. Sometimes what looks like anger is humiliation. Sometimes what looks like attraction is loneliness. Sometimes what looks like peace is emotional numbness. Sometimes what looks like confidence is dissociation. A highly developed inner life knows this, which is why you often need privacy to separate signal from noise. Jung would say that a great deal of human suffering comes from being possessed by forces we do not understand. We think, this is me, but it may just be a complex, a trigger, an inherited pattern, an unlived part of the self-demanding expression. So when you step away to think alone, you're doing something most people never learn to do. You are refusing to let the unconscious drive the car without being seen. You are making space between stimulus and identity. And that space is where rare intelligence lives, not in always having an answer, but in respecting the mystery of your own reaction long enough to discover the real one. 3. You intentionally revisit painful memories, not to suffer, but to decode them. This is where the script gets uncomfortable, because one thing highly intelligent people often do alone is something most people avoid at all costs. They go back to the memory, back to the humiliation, back to the conversation, back to the house they grew up in, at least in their mind, back to the version of themselves that broke and never fully explained why. And from the outside, this can look unhealthy. Why are you still thinking about that? Why can't you let it go? Why dwell on the past? But what people don't understand is this. You're not always returning to the pain to relive it. Sometimes you're returning to retrieve something, a meaning, a pattern, a lost part of yourself. Because rare intelligence is often archaeological. It doesn't just want relief. It wants revelation. It wants to know why certain moments still burn years later, why one sentence changed your personality, why one betrayal altered your nervous system, why one season of your life still lives under your skin like unfinished weather. Most people want closure quickly, but deep minds want comprehension, and comprehension often requires revisiting the scene, not once, many times, each time from a different level of consciousness. At first you revisit the memory as the victim, then as the witness, then as the analyst, then as the older self, then as someone finally able to name what happened. And suddenly the memory changes, not because the past changed, but because your relationship to it did. This is deeply Jungian, because healing, in this frame, is not about pretending the darkness never happened. It is about descending into it with a lamp. The rare individual is often willing to do that descent alone, to sit with uncomfortable memories, to examine the symbolic meaning of them, to ask, what was born in me there? What died in me there? What part of me got frozen in that room? What belief did I inherit from that pain that I still carry into love, work, intimacy, ambition, trust? This is not obsession, it is inner excavation. Now, of course, there is a line between reflection and self-torment, but when done consciously, returning to pain is not weakness. It is one of the bravest forms of intelligence, because many people remember their lives only in fragments. You are trying to integrate yours, and maybe that is why solitude matters so much to you, because when you're alone, the memory is no longer competing with performance. You don't have to act healed. You don't have to rush. You don't have to package your pain into a moral lesson for others. You can simply enter the old wound and ask it one honest question. What are you still trying to teach me? And sometimes what comes back is not pain. It's a missing piece of yourself. 4. You create private systems no one knows about. This one is subtle but powerful. If your intelligence is rare, there's a good chance you do something in private that almost no one sees. You create secret systems, not necessarily because you're organized in the traditional sense, but because your mind naturally builds inner architecture. Maybe you keep notes nobody would understand but you. Maybe you map patterns between people. Maybe you journal in fragments. Maybe you save strange quotes that feel like keys. Maybe you categorize your emotional states. Maybe you create rules, models, frameworks, voice memos, symbols, lists, or mental constellations that help you make sense of life. And to everyone else, it might look random. Too much, too abstract, too intense. But to you, it's survival. Because rare intelligence often doesn't live comfortably inside chaos unless it can translate that chaos into meaning. So you build systems, private ones, systems for understanding people, systems for tracking your own cycles, systems for decoding your behavior, systems for protecting your peace, systems for noticing when your soul is drifting, systems for remembering what the world keeps trying to make you forget. This is not just productivity, it's psychological structure. Jung understood that the mind speaks in symbols long before it speaks in clean logic. And highly intuitive, psychologically complex people often create personal rituals or structures that act as bridges between conscious and unconscious life. Maybe that's why your room, your notes app, your journals, your folders, your playlists, your saved screenshots, your unfinished writings all feel like extensions of your psyche. To other people they are clutter. To you, they are evidence. Evidence of thought. Evidence of becoming. Evidence that your inner life is not random, only untranslated. And there is something else here too. People with rare intelligence often cannot rely entirely on outer systems, because the world's frameworks are frequently too shallow for what they're trying to understand, so they build their own, quietly, in the shadows, not for applause, not for approval, but because the inner world is too rich to leave unstructured. This is why solitude can feel so productive for you, even when nothing obvious is happening. You may look like you're just sitting there, but inwardly You are arranging chaos into pattern. You are building a language for experiences that never came with instructions. You are turning invisible complexity into inner order. That is a rare gift. The world celebrates visible output. But some of the most intelligent work ever done is invisible. A person alone making a map of their own mind, so they don't get lost in it. 5. You observe yourself while you're feeling something. This is one of the strangest and most revealing traits of rare intelligence. When you're alone and emotional, angry, jealous, heartbroken, ashamed, excited, afraid, a part of you is not only feeling the emotion, it is watching you feel it. It's almost as if two selves exist at once. One self is drowning, the other is taking notes, and that can be exhausting, but it can also be extraordinary, because what this reveals is metaconsciousness, the ability to witness your own inner state while you're inside it. Most people become their emotions. You often become aware of them. Even in the middle of the storm, there's a voice in you quietly saying, "This is not just anger. This is old. This feeling is disproportionate. You're triggered. You're pretending not to care. You're hurt because your pride was involved. You wanted to be chosen. You're grieving something deeper than the event itself." That inner witness is rare, and if it's well developed, it becomes a form of psychological intelligence more valuable than raw intellect. Because a person who can observe themselves can interrupt patterns. A person who can witness themselves can evolve. A person who can name the hidden layer of their emotion is less likely to be ruled by it forever. But there's a shadow side too. Sometimes this self-observation becomes so constant that you struggle to simply be. You analyze your sadness while you're sad. You dissect joy while you're joyful. You monitor your reactions in real time. You wonder whether what you're feeling is true, performative, wounded, avoidant, attached, defensive, projected or inherited. And yes, that can be tiring. But it also means your psyche is not asleep. It means part of you refuses unconscious living. Jung might say that the goal is not to eliminate darkness, but to become conscious of it. And that is exactly what this private habit suggests. When you are alone, you do not merely emote. You witness, you question, you reflect. You catch yourself in the act of becoming. And over time, this gives you something powerful. Self-honesty, not the fake kind, not the aesthetic kind, not the kind people perform online. Real self-honesty, the kind that says, "I wasn't just hurt, I was humiliated. I didn't love them, I needed their validation. I'm not over it. I am pretending. I'm afraid. I wanted power, not connection. I said yes because I feared abandonment. I call it peace, but maybe I've just gone numb." That kind of awareness can feel heavy, but it is one of the clearest signs of unusual depth. Because many people spend their entire lives escaping themselves. You study yourself in private until the mask starts slipping, and once you've seen yourself clearly, you can never go back to living entirely on the surface. 6. You experiment with identities in private before revealing who you are. People often think identity is something stable, something obvious, something you either know or you don't. But rare intelligence tends to experience identity differently, not as a fixed label, but as a living question. So when you're alone, you often do something few people talk about. You try on different selves, not in a fake way, in an exploratory way. You imagine saying what you normally suppress. You imagine leaving the life you built. You imagine becoming colder, or softer, or bolder, or quieter. You write thoughts you'd never post. You admit ambitions you'd never say out loud. You test new beliefs in silence before attaching them to your name. This is important, because a highly intelligent psyche understands that the social self is often only partially real. Much of who we present to the world is adaptation, persona, a mask built for belonging, useful, necessary, even elegant at times, but still a mask. And solitude becomes the laboratory where you get to ask, who am I when no one needs anything from me? What do I actually believe when I'm not trying to fit into a tribe? What kind of life do I want if I stop performing the version of me that gets rewarded? What thoughts am I not allowed to think in public? What desires have I buried because they would disrupt my current identity? This is where Jung's energy enters strongly, because individuation, becoming who you really are, often begins with the uncomfortable recognition that the life you are living may be built around an incomplete self. So alone, you experiment. You entertain dangerous honesty. You consider possibilities that would confuse people. You allow contradictions. One day you want total solitude. Another day deep love. One day status disgusts you. Another day you crave impact. One day you're spiritual. Another day cynical. One day you forgive everyone. Another day you see the violence inside your own restraint. And instead of forcing a neat answer, you watch. You let the psyche reveal itself in phases. That is rare, because most people lock themselves into identities too early just to feel safe. But unusual intelligence tolerates ambiguity. It can sit inside the unfinished self. It can endure the instability of transformation. And the reason you do this alone is simple. Identity experimentation is sacred before it is social. If exposed too early, other people will rush to define you before you've understood yourself. They'll call you inconsistent when you're actually evolving. They'll call you confused when you're actually in dialogue with deeper truth. So you protect the process. You let the next version of yourself form in silence, and sometimes, by the time the world meets the new you, the transformation has already happened in private months ago. 7. You withdraw not because you hate people, but because too much falseness exhausts you. This may be the most misunderstood trait of all. If your intelligence is extremely rare, you probably spend a lot of time alone, and people often interpret that in the laziest possible ways. They think you're antisocial, arrogant, detached, broken, avoidant, moody, hard to please. But sometimes the truth is far more precise. You withdraw because constant superficiality drains your nervous system. You can tolerate noise. You can tolerate crowds. You can even tolerate performance for short periods. What exhausts you is prolonged contact with what feels false, forced laughter, shallow competition, predictable conversations, emotional dishonesty, social rituals built around impression management, people saying one thing and meaning another, people smiling with resentment in their eyes, people asking questions they don't really care about, people performing connection instead of offering it. For some minds, this is normal life. For yours, it feels spiritually claustrophobic. So, you retreat. Not because you're better than others, but because your psyche needs reality. And when reality is absent, solitude becomes cleaner than company. This is where the rare intelligence idea becomes dangerous if misunderstood. Because this isn't about superiority, it's about sensitivity to depth. A rare mind is not always a happier mind. Often it's lonelier. Because once you become highly attuned to contradiction, projection, persona, manipulation, emotional shallowness, and collective nonsense, a lot of social life starts to feel unreal. And Jung understood this burden well. The path toward consciousness often separates you from the comfort of the crowd, not because the crowd is evil, but because collective life rewards adaptation, while individuation requires honesty. And honesty is expensive. It can cost you belonging. It can cost you ease. It can cost you the illusion that everyone around you is as sincere as they seem. So you learn to love your own company. not in a glamorous way, in a necessary way. Your solitude becomes a place of psychic repair, a place where your mind can breathe again, where your speech returns to its natural rhythm, where your body unclenches, where your thoughts stop dressing themselves for public approval, where you remember that peace is not always found in connection. Sometimes it is found in the absence of distortion, and this is why some of the most intelligent people seem distant. Not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much of what is real and too little patience for what is fake. So when they disappear, it is not always withdrawal. Sometimes it is self-preservation. Sometimes it is devotion to truth. Sometimes it is the only place where their soul remains intact. And if you noticed something while listening to this, it may be this: none of these habits are flashy. None of them look impressive from the outside. No trophies, no applause, no public validation, just a person alone, thinking deeply, feeling honestly, watching themselves, returning to old pain, building meaning in silence, experimenting with identity, and stepping away from what feels false. That's the twist. Because the rarest intelligence is not always visible in what a person achieves. Sometimes it is visible in what they are willing to confront when they are alone. A person can be academically brilliant and still be a stranger to themselves. A person can be socially admired and psychologically asleep. A person can be successful, articulate, charming, high-functioning, and still have no real relationship with their own shadow. But the individual who enters solitude and comes back with self-knowledge, that person is dangerous in the best possible way, because once you begin to understand your own depths, you become harder to manipulate, harder to seduce with approval, harder to distract with noise, harder to control through shame. And maybe that's why rare intelligence so often develops in private, because truth usually whispers before it speaks, and only those who can bear silence long enough ever hear it. So if you do these things alone, if you talk to invisible versions of people and somehow discover your real feelings, if you disappear to think because your first reaction is never the whole truth, if you return to painful memories to decode the pattern, if you create private systems to survive inner chaos, if you observe yourself while your emotions